Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 369 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Shannon Appelcline. He's written tabletop gaming material for Chaosium, White Wolf, and Wizards of the Coast, and he's also written fiction for Green Knight Publishing and comic books for Skotos Tech. And we'll be speaking with him today about his 4-book series Designers and Dragons, A History of the Role-Playing Industry, which features profiles of over 100 different tabletop gaming companies from the 70s to today. And if you missed it, you should also check out our interview with Matt Barton back in episode 363, in which we discussed his new book Dungeons and Desktops, The History of Computer Role-Playing Games. And today's show is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And I want to give a special thank you to Anastasia Frolova and Matt Ray, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Alright, so now let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Shannon Appelcline. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in tabletop RPGs?
I first started playing tabletop RPGs when I was 10 or 11 back in the early 80s. I don't know exactly where I saw the Dungeons and Dragons game, but I do know I asked my dad for a copy of it, and he got for me for my birthday. It was the old red-covered book that was done by Tom Moldvay. It's called the BX edition now. And my problem after I got it was I didn't have anyone to play with it. So my dad, being one of the greatest dads ever, sat down, learned the rules, even though it was the type of thing he didn't really like, and he actually ran a little dungeon for me. The only thing he wasn't able to figure out were how the combat worked, and so he just came up with kind of choose-your-own-adventure type ways to deal with combat, like there were some skeletons and you threw rocks at them. So that was my first experience, and I played role-playing games throughout my teenage years, continued into college, and continue to now.
So what would be some of the other games that had the biggest impact on you?
Well, after Dungeons & Dragons itself, the second set of games that I played were two ones from Chaosium called Stormbringer and Hawkmoon, which were based on Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion heroes. And that kind of got me into Chaosium's entire D100 system. RuneQuest was a big play with me in college, and overall it's been one of my favorite games. I was very interested in the fandom and very much a part of it, particularly in the 90s. The other game that had a very big influence on me, and it was something I learned at college where I learned a lot of my games that kind of went further out beyond D&D, was a small press game called Ars Magica, which was done by two utterly unknown people at the time named Jonathan Tweed and Mark Reinhagen, who of course went on to do much bigger games, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition and Vampire the Masquerade, respectively. Since then, I've done any number of things. In more recent years, I've become really interested in the indie gaming scene, mainly because of my work on Designers and Dragons, where I learned about all these cool things out there. So one of my most recent games that I feel was pretty influential on me was Luke Crane's Burning Wheel. Pendragon is also in there somewhere as another thing done by Greg Stafford and Chaosium, but kind of different from their D100, very much about figuring out how to have a game that was all about knights being knights and people having personality traits and families and things that went a lot beyond the standard designs of dungeon crawls that you'd find in Dungeons & Dragons. But I still play Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, too. I pretty recently ran long campaigns for both of them.
Now, when you say that you started getting involved with fandom, sort of what form did that take?
I have always been a writer, and so in the 90s, RuneQuest was kind of dying out because Avalon Hill, who had the license at the time, had first stopped publishing Gloriantha stuff and then stopped publishing very much that was very good, and eventually killed the game entirely. And during that time, this very rich magazine fandom rose up. Tales of the Reaching Moon out of the UK was the first big magazine in that era, and a number of others started coming out. Trade Talk, the Book of Drastic Resolutions, and a number of others. So I started interacting with some of these people online. This was the early 90s, and so there were mailing lists and digest where you could talk with people online. And from there, I got involved and started writing for some of the fanzines. Trade Talk, which is a German fanzine, is the one that I did the most writing for. A little bit of RuneQuest stuff and a little bit of stuff for Chaosium's other games. I also worked for Book of Drastic Resolutions, which put out 3 issues of a very nice fanzine here in the U.S., and did some other scattered writing for 10 or 15 years. And I'd also done a little bit of that for Ars Magica previous to RuneQuest, just, 4 or 5 articles for a couple of different magazines.
I mean, because you were working full-time at Chaosium for a while, right?
I was. That was afterward. I think I worked at Chaosium from 1996 to 1998. To a certain extent, it kind of came out of the fanzine and other interests. The one other thing I did is right after college, I started putting out my own electronic digest called the Chaosium Digest, and that was kind of a foot in the door. It let me write Chaosium material. It let me collect together other people's, and it let the people at Chaosium know who I was. So when they were very momentarily doing quite well, thanks to the Mythos card game and hiring, I was able to go on there for 2 years until they started doing very not well again, also because of the Mythos card game.
Yeah, you said in the book that there was a period of time toward the ends where nobody was getting paid, that you were working there?
I was getting paid. I was the only person that was getting paid. What happened was the whole CCG collectible card game fad had a very large effect on the role-playing industry, and that's because Wizards of the Coast obviously debuted the format and showed how successful it was, and so a lot of role-playing companies started putting out their own. Chaosium was one of these. They put out something called the Mythos CCG. It was innovative and very successful. Each time they put out a new set, they were getting more orders than the previous, and at some point, the people at Chaosium said, hey, we don't really like the fact that all of our money is going to the CCG. If we ever have a failure with this, it will kill the whole company because there is so much money in this right now. And so they came up with this idea of coming out with what they called a standard set. And the standard set was a non-collectible set that was totally compatible with the collectible sets. The idea was to let them put out a product that could stay on shelves, that could get people into the game, and that wouldn't have the same highs and lows as a collectible card game did, where it either brings you huge amounts of money or puts you out of business. It's actually a model that's been used very successfully more recently by Fantasy Flight Games in general, who did their living card games. But for Chaosium, this was 1997, I think, and no one really understood what they were doing, and the distributors told them to print huge numbers of it like it was a collectible game. And Chaosium, much to their deficit, listened to their distributors, did this, and by the time it came in, the distributor said, no, we don't necessarily want that many of that game. And so by the time I was in my last 6 to 9 months at Chaosium, which I think was 98, we had a pallet of Mythos standard game set, which was 6 to 9 feet tall, sitting out in our warehouse, unsold. We had not sold enough to pay for the print run. Role-playing companies, any publishing company, they're all about cash flow, about getting money in from the last product and immediately putting it out to print the next product. And we'd killed our cash flow because it was all sitting in those boxes of Mythos standard game. And so we couldn't print things. And so most of my work was layout at Chaosium. I did some editorial too. And so in those 6 to 9 months, I started taking my books, putting them on a desk next to my computer, and going on to the next book. And by the time I left, I had 6, 7, 8 books that took another 2 to 5 years to actually get printed. Most of the other people had been laid off by that time. We had the couple of owners, Greg Stafford, Lynn Willis, and Charlie Crank, who had stopped taking salaries because they couldn't afford it. And just before I was getting ready to go, the last couple of other people left, and so there was literally no one else getting a paycheck but me, and my paychecks were often coming in a week or two late on a semi-monthly paycheck. So it was a bad time, but it's really not untypical for the role-playing industry, which has really narrow margins like a lot of game publishing does.
So then after that, sort of between the time that you left Chaosium and the time that you started on Designers and Dragons, what was your involvement with role-playing?
Well, right after Chaosium, I was very burned out. I didn't go to a con for years afterward. I still barely go to cons. I was barely buying role-playing books. I was barely playing role-playing games. I immediately went over to a company called Certicom, which was a cryptography company. That's kind of more what I'm professionally trained to do, technical writing. And so I did a lot of work with cryptography patents and other stuff that a lot of people in the gaming industry would probably find very, very boring. And that continued on for a few years. But the thing is, the person that I went to work for at Certicom, now a longtime friend named Christopher Allen, I met him at a gaming convention. And so after he got out of Certicom and did a few other things, he started up an online game company. And after he started up the online game company, an online game site called RPGNet was in dire straits because it had been sold to a .com company and that had fallen through. And he said, hey, I would be willing to purchase that site and, give you a place to run it and all of that. And so I kind of ended up back in the role-playing industry semi-accidentally, though, like I said, it was because the person I'd begun working for I'd met at a gaming convention. RPGNet is actually what directly led me to Designers and Dragons. As we expanded the site and I programmed things on the site, because I also do programming, one of the new features I decided to add was a gaming index where we could index and list all of the role-playing products that had ever been produced, which was semi-feasible when we started it in 2005 or so, and with the huge advent of PDFs has become almost impossible. And as I was coding that, I started entering stuff from my collection, and I got to a company called Imperium Games, and they were a producer of Traveler after GDW went out of business in the mid-90s. I'd bought most of their early products, but then I'd stopped buying games after I left Chaosium, and all I knew is that they weren't around anymore. And so I put in all of my material. I found a couple of things I didn't own and put that into, and I said, what happened to these guys? And that's what got me started on Designers and Dragons.
And then you decided to do basically the same thing for like 100 other companies?
It was in a few steps. Imperium Games was the first history I wrote. It was not the first history I published because there were some weird questions in the company about whether money had been stolen and other things that I wasn't quite ready to address right away. But given my long history with Chaosium, I said, hey, writing that first history was kind of fun. How about I write one for Chaosium, too? And that one, again, got slightly sidelined, and eventually the first one I published was Wizards of the Coast. And when I say published, again, most of my effort was going to RPGNet at this time, and I was always looking for ways that I could personally contribute things that would kind of model the kind of content that we wanted to see. And I said, hey, these histories that I've been playing around with would be good content for RPGNet. And so I published several of the histories. I was managing about one a month. Sometimes I'd break them up. I started going further and further into other companies that I had experience with. And after I'd done a dozen or so of them, a publisher contacted me and said, hey, we'd really like to turn these into a book. And I hadn't been in the role-playing publishing side of things for 5-10 years at that point. And so I hadn't even been thinking about it at that level, but I said, sure. And then I learned how much work it would be to actually put together 40 histories or so for a book. I put them together in a, increasingly insane set of late night work periods because it was always something I was doing after the actual paying job. And then I got done with that, and the first publishing deal fell through for various reasons. But then I was able to do it at a more leisurely rate, and we had maybe 60 by the time the first edition published with Mongoose, and maybe 100 by the time the second and currently definitive edition published through my current publisher, who is Evil Hat. So the way the 100 got done was in little steps, kind of one stage of publishing at a time.
And you say in the book that somehow the Ends Game bookstore was involved in this book coming about?
So Endgame, unfortunately now, was a game store located in Oakland, California. Really great community, because they didn't just look at, hey, we want to sell games. They said, hey, we want to create a community of gamers, and obviously we will sell games to them. And so they had a great play space, and I've met any number of people there. One of the people that I met there was Chris Hanrahan, who was one of the owners of the store. Chris Hanrahan was also the business officer, I forget the exact title because it's changed a few times, at Evil Hat. And so I think he knew I'd done the original edition of the book through Mongoose and had been saying, hey, if this ever comes free, please talk to me, and we'd love to have it at Evil Hat. And so the Mongoose edition came out. I'm really happy that they published it. They published it in a much smaller print run than I would have liked. I think there were about 750 copies of the original pseudo-leather-bound edition that Mongoose did, and it didn't really have as much marketing or editing as I would have liked to see. And so it got to the point where they'd sold out. It was 6 months later. I always try and be real careful with my contracts that I can reclaim rights to my content if things go out of print. And so when that happened, I talked to Evil Hat. They said they'd still be happy to publish it. Chris, I'm certain, heavily pushed on it and is the reason it's at Evil Hat. And then I reclaimed the rights from Mongoose and pushed it over. In-game also had some other effects in that I met people who were involved with Evil Hat. I met people who were involved with the indie scene, because In-Game was always very proactive about pushing indie games. And so all of that added to the content of what was in the book, too. But absolutely, the second edition of the book and the one that's still in print would not have come about without In-Game. Unfortunately, In-Game closed just about 7 months ago. It closed in January. And so they aren't around anymore, but the community that they created is still here and there in other places in Oakland, and obviously the effects of what they still created are there in my own Designers and Dragons and other games and books which had their origins there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it looks like to get it into print, you had a Kickstarter that raised over $100,000, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, we did. It was a very successful Kickstarter. Designers and Dragons was, I feel like a lot of my products, I get really enthused about something, and I'm never really sure if there's an audience or not. With Designers and Dragons, I'd always gotten a lot of comments and interest from people on the net when I produced it, but it was a real question of how well would that translate to a printed product. And Mongoose didn't tell us a lot since they'd only done 750 copies of it. The actual Kickstarter that we did was one of Evil Hat's best. They've done a few better. I think their Fate Core did better. Their Dresden card game did better. And we just got a huge amount of support. It probably helps that we did Kickstarted for what was 4 books. And so you say it was over 100,000, and it definitely was. But on the other hand, it was about 25,000 a book. And so, that's not quite the same notable level there, but it was definitely enough to say, hey, we want to do this book. There's interest here, and I hope there's going to be interest for other books that I'm putting out in the future on the topic.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I mean, I'm kind of in awe of these books. I just almost can't believe that something like this exists. There's so much detail. There's so many cover illustrations and just so many, facts and figures and financial things. I mean, could you just talk about the scale of this project and how much help did you have gathering all this information?
Right. The scale of the project was obviously huge, and the only way that it possibly came about was doing one article at a time, one company at a time. If I had ever looked and said, hey, I need to put out 4 books, which together were like 500,000 words or something, I probably would have run in the other direction. But I got a process down where I decided the company that I wanted to write about. I extensively researched them as much as I could. For the older companies, this usually involved going through magazine collections. For newer companies, this often involved going through the internets. My prime sources were often game design articles about how people designed games, interviews, particularly interviews done at the time as opposed to much later. And for more recent stuff, there were obviously press releases and other press and marketing articles done by companies. Once as I collected these things, I'd kind of throw them all into a file, and after I had all of the content, I would try and figure out, hey, how does this all make sense as a story? Because I feel, at least for the histories that I'm trying to write, that I'm trying as much to provide a narrative as just a cold listing of events. And obviously, the narrative needs to encompass the cold listing of events, but I feel like there really are stories that can be told in any history, hence the name. Once I got all of that done and kind of organized, I'd then write everything up. And sometimes when I wrote things up, I'd list myself questions, which were often the details that you discussed, because sometimes they were in the material I found and sometimes they weren't. And at that point, that's when I'd go to other people. I would then try and hunt out any principals from the company who could give me information. I'd send them a complete draft of what I'd written. I'd ask them specific questions, and they'd send it back. And sometimes they'd say, hey, this is all great. It sounds exactly like what we did. I don't know how you figured it out. And sometimes they'd say, I can't believe you got this so wrong. I'm very angry at this. I need you to fix it. And, you know, if anything, the latter feedback was more helpful than the former, obviously. And at that point, I'd revise it, send it around a few more times, and we'd eventually lock something down. So that was the whole process. As I got further into things, the first stage would usually take about a week. And I say a week, but that's kind of a week in my free time. So maybe 10 hours, 15 hours for an average company. And then the back and forth of finishing it would linger for time afterwards.
Right. Well, and there's definitely a lot of stories, like you were saying, in this book. And I'm not that familiar with the sort of behind-the-scenes aspects of the tabletop role-playing industry. You know, I'd say I know a lot about second edition Dungeons & Dragons, and I know a lot about Amber Diceless role-playing. And my knowledge of the fields, other than that, is pretty spotty. So there was a lot in this that really surprised me. And one of the things that really surprised me was just how many stories there were about fraud, embezzlement, lawsuits, and people just having mental breakdowns and disappearing from the industry. Would you say that the tabletop RPG industry has an unusually high amount of those things, or not?
It's hard for me to say, because I don't know what that would look like for another industry. Certainly, the board game industry is another industry that I'm a big fan of, and I am aware of a few lawsuits that have occurred in that industry. I don't know of many. I'm not aware of many situations of embezzlement and fraud, though every once in a while nowadays you see Kickstarters that go horribly awry. I'm not aware of many cases of mental breakdown, but I don't know if I'd find all of those if I really dug in like I did with the role-playing industry. With the role-playing industry, I similarly could have said to you before I wrote this, oh yeah, I know about when Palladium sued Wizards of the Coast. Oh yeah, I know that there were lawsuits between Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax and a couple of other people involved at TSR. But I don't know that I could have told you the depth of that. With all of that said, just kind of factually, I feel like there is a lot of it in the industry. And I know I've had at least one person who read it who said that he was amazed for how such a small industry with such small margins, where there just wasn't a lot of money involved comparatively, that there was so much drama.
You said that you actually got a cease and desist from TSR once?
I did. Back in the 90s, I was helping to administer a machine at Berkeley called soda.berkeley.edu. This was in the early days of the internet, well before it became commercial, well before most people had access to it. But since I had administrative control of this, powerful internet-connected machine at UC Berkeley, and since there were these mailing lists where people were putting great content, I said, hey, I'd like to start collecting some of this content. And so I collected some content for Ars Magica. I think by then I was running the Ars Magica mailing list. And for some other games I should note that were not D&D. And then TSR in the mid-90s got really nasty about the internet and started sending everyone cease and desist letters if they were hosting any D&D content. And one of the ones they sent to was me, though I wasn't hosting any D&D content, just Ars Magica, probably RuneQuest was the other one by then. It kind of shows that besides the fact that they were being very nasty to their fans, they weren't being very careful about what they were doing. And so, this was my college years. I was young and feisty and angry, and I sent a very, very angry letter back to them that said something to the effect of, not only am I not hosting any D&D content, but I'd rather poke my eyes out with a dull stick before I did, because you are scumbags. And never heard back from them. But I think part of what I wrote in Designers and Dragons itself was, that made me really angry. I didn't play any D&D games until 1988 or 89. I have to believe that it made a lot of other people very angry too. The internet was a lot smaller place by then, but it kind of felt to me part of the story of how TSR was really spiraling down, and that, they were turning even on their fans at this point.
Right, and it's so weird, like you said, that the stakes are so small and there were so many lawsuits that it seems like really harmed the industry as a whole, and that everybody would have been better off just chilling out a little bit.
Well, I totally believe that. And when I say the stakes are small, the one company that the stakes weren't small for were TSR. They had 100, 200, 300 employees at the top. They were making tens of millions of dollars. They were a very large company. But they were also the source of a lot of the lawsuits. They weren't helping the industry. There were also other lawsuits like the one I mentioned between Palladium and Wizards of the Coast that they just didn't do anyone any good. And the interesting thing about the Palladium lawsuit was Palladium sued Wizards of the Coast over a game book called The Primal Ardor, where they'd included stats for a lot of different games, and they'd been very careful about it. The general legal consensus at the time, which they got, was that you could do that type of thing because it wasn't protected by derivative copyright, as long as you were very careful of the trademarks, and they were very careful. But Kevin Ciambita has always been very he's been very strident in control of his properties and in what he believes is right in the industry. So he sued. And what almost happened as a result is Wizards of the Coast almost didn't come out with Magic the Gathering, because that was the product that they had on the edge of their production schedule at the time. In fact, they created a separate company at the time to hold the Magic the Gathering IP so that it wouldn't accidentally get swept up into this. But if this hadn't been settled, who knows if they would have been able to come out with it. And you could certainly say that when you're looking at the role-playing industry, that the collectible card game fad was maybe more bad than good. But when you just look at the innovation of our hobbyist industries and overall, not coming out with that would have been horrible. There are so many people that have greatly enjoyed Magic and Pokemon and the many other CCGs there. And that's just one example where a lawsuit almost killed something really innovative. And there's probably a lot more cases we don't know of where lawsuits did.
I mean, one thing that really struck me reading the book was I think most people think about having an office and employees as kind of the first step for running a business. But it seems like in the tabletop industry, that's sort of the peak of success is if you actually have an office and employees.
Yeah, that's very accurate. When I worked at Chaosium, when I started working there, they had 11 employees, and that was really great for a role-playing company. I think maybe in the 80s and 90s, it was more likely that a role-playing company did have an actual office and did have actual employees. But the 80s and 90s were certainly the peak of success of the role-playing industry before maybe the modern day. The modern day has changed things a lot. Imperium Games, who, as I mentioned, is as the company that really got me started in writing the Designers and Dragons histories, they're also the first company I know of that was a decent-sized company that did not try and have a central base of operations. What they did instead was they had all of these employees, most of whom were previous TSR employees, as it happens, scattered across mostly the United States, I believe, and they'd come together for a big summit in the Great Lakes area once a year. I believe it was around Gen Con or Origins. But they were really groundbreakers in that. Kind of at that period, you had two things. You had the companies who were big enough to have offices, and you had the publishers. I wouldn't even call them companies, who were just one or two people doing it as a hobby, in their free time, like I do Designers and Dragons as a hobby right now in my free time. In the 21st century, I think a couple things have happened. I feel like generally the role-playing industry doesn't have the same chance for high success of smaller companies as it did in the 20th century. Wizards of the Coast certainly says that Dungeons & Dragons is doing as well as it ever has been, and there's a lot of indications that it's doing very, very well. But I suspect you'd find there aren't a lot of other companies that are at the level of companies like GDW, ICE, Hero Games in the 80s and 90s who were able to have their, own studios. And at the same time, we have PDFs, which allow easier publication. We have the internet, which makes it easier to communicate. And so I think a lot more people are falling into this level of, hey, just a couple of people doing a hobby, or, maybe several people now doing a hobby, and we can, do it professionally. The internet in general has been a game changer. Chaosium, who I've mentioned a few times, they don't have a central office anymore. There was a large changing of the guard of the company a few years ago, and they're now scattered across the world, Australia, Germany, the United States.
Well, right, and to sort of underscore that point about how close-knit and small the industry has become, I mean, a lot of these games that you mentioned as being successful games or groundbreaking or setting the standard and things, they have print runs of 1,000, 500, 250, things like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the indie games are probably in the 100 to 1,000 range. I think anything you see in a game store nowadays is still going to have a print run of 1,000 or more, but they're all relatively small. I know when I was working at Chaosium in the 90s, our minimum print run was somewhere in the 2,000 range. When we did a new rule book, we'd be 5,000 to 6,000, and I don't think a lot of people are doing that nowadays. Wizards of the Coast clearly is. Paizo clearly is. Fantasy Flight Games is, though a lot of their interest nowadays is in board games instead, which has been a general trend. And you start going down from there, and I could probably name several others and miss several others, Modiphius, Green Ronin, but maybe you're at less than a dozen companies who are regularly doing print runs of 2,000 plus. I think a lot of stuff is a lot smaller press than people would guess.
But I mean, one thing that was striking was that with Kickstarter, even if you only have 500 people interested in a game, if those 500 people are really, really interested in that game, you can, gather up a lot of money to keep making products for that game.
I feel like Kickstarter has been a savior of the industry to a large amount. Certainly there's the possibility for Kickstarters to go horribly wrong. When I say Chaosium just recently came under new management, that's primarily because Kickstarter killed the old company. They overpromised. They didn't take into account shipping rates. These are primarily problems that we understand at this point now. We just didn't in the early years of Kickstarter. The biggest thing about Kickstarter that the average fan may not understand is that Kickstarter really works for publishers because they get to sell directly to the fans. Usually what happens is that a publisher sells to a distributor who sells to a retailer, and what that means is that the publisher usually gets 40% of the sale price of the item. They sell it on Kickstarter, they get 100%, and that makes a huge difference in how large or small of a print run you can print. The other advantage about Kickstarter is that it largely takes away the concerns about cash flow. I told you that when I worked for Chaosium, we'd usually see the money come in from one product and then immediately go out to the next product that was waiting to go to the printers. With Kickstarter, instead, you get from the fans, we're not supposed to say they're pre-orders. Kickstarter says they're not pre-orders, but they're the next closest thing. And so you don't have to wait for your previous book to be successfully sold. When you have a product that the fans will be interested in, you can put it out there and they will help you get published. It's kind of an amazing empowerment of the people that greatly advantages publishers.
You do say, though, that if you're selling directly to your customers, and especially if you're only publishing PDFs, that it makes it very hard to attract new fans because they're not coming across your games in retail stores.
That's certainly always been my concern. I could be wrong also, but it's certainly always been my concern. I feel like a lot of the companies that have tried to go the only online method, White Wolf were the people who really led that charge. But we've also seen it from the Harn books for a while were not available from game stores. It certainly feels like there is less room for attraction there. I mean, game stores are big marketing havens for publishers. They're places that people can go in and see their books on shelves and page through them. And even if you just look at like retail online, we still haven't figured out how to recreate that experience where you can kind of scroll through a bookcase of books and page through the ones that you like. But on the other hand, some people are doing very well with their Kickstarter online methodologies, but I think it's because they're mixing it with traditional methodology and maybe also really pushing on social media as well. It's quite possible that as time goes on, we're going to have to figure out how to better attract a new audience as we're using these newer online methodologies for sales. But we're not there yet, and so it's a pretty uncomfortable time, I feel like, for companies that are trying to go online only.
Do you ever feel tempted to start your own company, or would you ever be like a consultant for startup RPG companies or anything like that?
No and no. I think once you read Designers and Dragons, you would see how you'd have to be really, really enthusiastic and optimistic and almost self-sacrificial to want to create a role-playing company. I have huge respect for the people that do, but that's because I know exactly how hard it is to do it. Consulting is just something that doesn't particularly interest me because, I'm a researcher, a writer. I don't want to get locked down with one company and telling them things that I picked up from this. I'd love them to learn it from the books. And I say that, but actually I think I'm going to probably create a little company for Designers and Dragons just to kind of hold my IP and protect it, but not a publishing company. I would like someone else to do that still.
Well, yeah, I feel like anyone who is interested in writing or publishing tabletop role-playing games should read this series of books because there's just so much, as I said, so much information in here. And I almost feel like even if you're not particularly interested in tabletop games, if you're just interested in business, you would want to read this series because it's just so many examples of how people start companies, what goes wrong, what occasionally goes right. There's just so much that you can learn from all these different case studies.
Oh, thank you very much. Certainly, I always tried when I was writing the articles to not just relate the history, but also to kind of abstract out some of the lessons and perhaps even more so to connect up the trends and the things that were happening at different places. I also took the opportunity of individual company histories to say, hey, what can this tell us about the kind of larger world of role-playing or of business? And so, for example, the Peso Publishing article, which appears in the Odd Odds book, has a lot of information in it about magazine publishing and what goes right and wrong there. There's actually a chapter in there called something like Tinker Ship in the Dark or something like that, which was a quote from one of the principals at Peso talking about how magazine publishing in this era is probably gone now. Was like trying to, steer a tinker ship in the dark. You had no idea where you were going. You couldn't see the obstacles, and it could be disastrous at any moment. But certainly I tried to look at, hey, what are the things that have gone right again and again and have gone wrong again and again? And so I hope that information would be relatively available to people, even if it wasn't quite the top purpose of the histories and Designers and Dragons.
I mean, one of the pieces that I abstracted out is that you should be careful with licensing. And I thought this was striking. In one of the notes, you say, for other gaming material in IP hell, read Skyrealms Publishing or any licensed game ever.
Yeah. Licensing has had a very interesting history in the role-playing industry. And there's two different types of licensing there. There's role-playing companies that have licensed properties from fiction usually, and then there are role-playing companies that have licensed other role-playing companies. And back in the 70s and 80s, it was all really casual, and I know of a couple different companies who got like lifetime licenses from people like Michael Moorcock, and I think that was also the case for the token license. And, nowadays, there's very strict licenses that, have very limited times and could be killed at any point and could be, greatly delayed because people had to look over permissions. And so I feel like licensing has a couple of dangers that just can leap out and bite you. One is that you put a lot of work into really, expanding and improving a property, which, for example, West End Games did back in the 80s with the Star Wars game. It's kind of weird to think of now, but after the original trilogy of movies, Star Wars was essentially dead, and the only people that were actively developing it were West End Games. And they put huge amounts of work into it, and, now they're not there, and Star Wars has moved on a few times. The other danger is, besides losing all of this work that you've done, you can also lose all of your products because suddenly you don't have the ability to print them anymore and maybe even sell them anymore. And I feel like this has become even more acute in the age of PDFs, something that impacts fans maybe more than publishers, in that entire lines that were only available or primarily available as electronic documents are suddenly gone from the earth, as it were. There's just no way to purchase them anymore because they're no longer legally sellable. So despite the fact that there's all these dangers, publishers clearly find them very profitable as well, because you look at a lot of the big name companies now and they're publishing huge numbers of licensed works. Cubicle 7 has Doctor Who and any other number of licensed games. Modiphius is publishing a lot of Swedish games, among other things. Green Ronin recently put out The Expanse. So I just hope that people are more cognizant of the dangers at this point.
I mean, you mentioned that there was the Michael Moorcock game. There were actually a lot of games based on works by fantasy and science fiction authors that I had no idea that these even existed. I mean, I came across, there's games based on David Drake, Lois McMaster Bujold, Terry Pratchett, Charles Stross, Jim Butcher, Larry Niven, Glenn Cook, Jack Vance, and Larry Correa were just ones I wrote down. I mean, I had no idea there were so many of those.
Well, I think a lot of the role-playing industry, a lot of the professionals in the industry were people who are always also fantasy and science fiction fans. If you look at the original edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it had the infamous Appendix N, which was the set of books that Gary Gygax thought would be of interest in to help people figure out how to run their D&D games. Tolkien's in there, though he says it wasn't a very big influence. Conan, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse, or a lot of other sword and sorcery fantasy from the 50s, 60s, I guess probably the very start of the 70s. And I think that's continued, that probably 1 in 2 games that you see that are based on licenses, I wouldn't be surprised if they're based on licenses because someone was a really big fan of a property and said, hey, I think I can do a great game of that. And, you know, the other 1 and 2 are probably someone said, hey, I think we can make great money on that. But as I said, for myself personally, Chaosium's Hawkmoon and Stormbringer games were 2 of the ones that really expanded the industry for me. I still have my original boxes for those games on the shelf right next to me here. I think for the most part, I'm personally more interested in either creating my own worlds or playing with worlds that people have created specifically for role-playing games. But I've certainly got my small share of licensed games on my shelves. We're all fans.
I mean, do you think that if it's like the Larry Niven game or the Lois McMaster Bujold game, do people mostly collect those kind of because they like those books and they're fans of the series and it's kind of a curiosity, or are there a lot of people actually playing something like that?
I think that one of the secrets of the role-playing industry is that people buy a lot more books to read and are put on their shelves than they will ever play. I think that role-playing supplements in particular tend to be read and not necessarily played. I think that probably goes right over to all of those licensed games. I'm a big fan of Larry Niven, and so I have his Ring World game on my shelf and its supplement, and I don't think I've ever played it. It's another of Chaosium's games, and so, you know, maybe I tried it once, but it's unlikely I ever have, and I think that's probably true for a lot of people. It's kind of fun to see these worlds that you've read about statistically defined, and a lot of these licensed games also do these miraculous jobs of really developing the world and showing it in detail that you never would have seen in the actual book. ICE's Middle-earth Role-Playing was one of the first really extensive licensed lines. It was in the 80s primarily. And they just did an amazing job putting out supplement after supplement, you know, chunky 60, 80-page supplements that extensively detailed individual lands in Middle-earth at a level that, you know, you would never see even in the very extensive Lord of the Rings books. As I mentioned, the Star Wars role-playing game that was put out by West End Games was also considered really groundbreaking for how much it detailed the world, to the point that when the fiction series started going again in the late 80s, early 90s, whenever it was, the fiction authors were sent copies of a lot of the West End books as great source material. So, yeah, I think a lot of it probably is unread. I know that a lot of it's played too, because you see people talking about it. But if a lot of it's being just, you know, read instead of played, it's because there's such great material in there that supplements your experience in reading the books, seeing the TV shows, watching the movies, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't have a lot of behind-the-scenes knowledge of the industry, but I have always sort of suspected that most RPG books are perused rather than played. I've always sort of wondered how many people really can learn the rules of a 300-page book, let alone 10, 10 books of rules about a game. And so on that, this line kind of jumps out at me. So you say, while working with his Shadowrun freelancer, Boyle learns that even Shadowrun's top designers didn't understand its complex rules.
Yeah, I think that's in general the case. Rule systems can become very complex. A lot of them are very complex out of the book. I know that when I played First Edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons back in the 80s, we never played it by the rules, and that's because some of the rules were so complex and convoluted that we just threw them out and used something simpler. I think it's relatively rare that people play precisely by the rules, and that may be because they don't understand them, and maybe because they don't like them, whichever. I think it's possible to learn most role-playing games from the books. I think I've learned many from the books, but who knows, because it's also integrated with maybe you played it with someone else first. Maybe you saw a video nowadays, an actual play online. But it goes all the way back to the dawn of the industry. When you look at how D&D came out in 1974, I think no one felt like they could really learn it accurately from the rule book. And so you actually had very distinctive styles of play developing in different parts of the country, because these were parts of the country that had very diverse groups of people who weren't interacting with each other, and so they understood the rules in different ways. We've gotten a lot better since then, but it's still a pretty tricky subject to figure out. We've had a lot of work with what are called quick starts, where publishers try and publish an easy set of the rules that will be easily accessible to people, usually as part of an adventure. That's clearly still a learning process. Any game is a little hard to learn from the rules, and role-playing games are pretty complex as games go.
I was really struck by, there's a game called Aftermath, and you said that it had 27 hit locations for a dog, including 2 distinct tail hit locations.
Yeah. Aftermath was a game put out by FGU. It was, I think, FGU. But it was in the 80s. And the 80s, there tend to be trends for how the role-playing industry developed in each decade. And one of the trends of the 80s was definitely complexity. Games aren't that complex now, though you certainly see some streams of development that are. The D&D 3E game was fairly complex. Pathfinder still is, at least through the first edition that's out there right now. So you still see some of that, but not as much as in the 80s with games like Aftermath.
Well, so talk about this concept of the fantasy heartbreaker. That was a new term to me.
Yeah. Fantasy heartbreaker was a term that was originated by Ron Edwards in an article that he produced. Ron Edwards basically suggested that a lot of people came up with their own versions of D&D, not seeing how the rest of the industry worked, and they repeated a lot of the ideas that had been already seen by the rest of the industry. When Edwards wrote the article, one of the things he was saying was, hey, all of these games have been, dumped into the dustbin of history, but there was really great stuff in them, and there was really great enthusiasm. And so even though they didn't do well because they weren't as original as the designers thought they were, there still might be little things in there that we could find. The term more generally now has come to mean, those games that are just copies of D&D, and they have a skill system because the designer never played anything but D&D.
Well, right, and that was one thing that really struck me reading the 2000s volume of Designers and Dragons, was just how much innovation there's been in the indie space, and how, I would really strongly recommend anyone who's thinking about designing an RPG to read this and just see how many new dynamics, new rule systems and things have been bandied about in recent years.
Yeah, the indie revolution has been amazing, and it was mostly started by Ron Edwards, who I just talked about. He did a great job of really enabling other people to do indie games through his support of The Forge, which was an online site for talking about indie games, through his support of other indie publishers at Gen Con. In Designers and Dragons, the aughts, there's a couple different sections which are all about indie publishers. And as I said, when I wrote a company article, I always tried to figure out what other things can I talk about in this article that kind of show larger trends. And so in those articles, it tends to be, hey, what great new mechanics did people talk about? And you say there's been a lot of innovation, and it's really been extraordinary. You go from 1974, when D&D came out, to 1999, I think, was when Ron Edwards came out with his professional version of Sorcerer, which was his first game. And there was certainly innovation in the industry, but it tended to be mechanical innovation, skill systems, different ways to do experience. It was, it kind of slightly changed the way you thought about role-playing games instead of totally innovating it. And there were exceptions. Greg Stafford's Pendragon looked at, families and passions and personality traits. You mentioned Derek Wujcik's Amber Diceless role-playing game, which, as is obvious from the name, was diceless. There was certainly innovation in that period. But then you hit 1999, and it just broke loose. And it went back to earlier things. I could keep listing the earlier ones. Jonathan Tweet's Over the Edge, Hogshead's Publishing's New Style Game. These were all ones that looked at role-playing in different ways. But then I think because the indie community created by Ron Edwards had these communities, both online and in person at places like Gen Con, they could really bounce ideas off of each other. And so suddenly you had a lot of resource-based games where, instead of having a randomizer for if something succeeded, you decided when you wanted to expend your resources because the things were important to you. You had bidding games, which were another way to look at resource management. And you had a real flowering of this, what had previously been a very, very small part of gaming called story games, where you could suddenly say, hey, what if the games weren't just about characters trying to accomplish goals, but what if they were about a larger story? And so one of my absolute favorite games in the industry nowadays is a little indie game called Microscope. And Microscope is about creating basically a vast timeline of a world, a solar system, a universe, a planet, a city, whatever you want to do, but some type of vast timeline. And so you do have characters kind of bouncing in and out of these individual events that you're inventing for your timeline as you go along, but they're not the focus. This vast timeline is. And it's just one example of this huge innovation we've had. And one thing that I've really enjoyed seeing is that since Designers and Dragons was published, an increasing number of these indie ideas seem to be coming further and further into more mainstream role-playing games. Part of that is companies like Evil Hat, who kind of made it big in the mainstream role-playing world. But part of it is just, there was a system of games called Cortex Plus, which came out from Margaret Weiss Publishing, and Smallville was one of them. And these were games that kind of tried to look through past the mechanics that we saw and past trying to simulate to instead say, hey, what's important to be able to tell stories? And so I almost feel like the indie revolution, which I write about a lot in Designers and Dragons, by the time we get through the tens is going to be done, because role-playing has been, revolutionized to a certain extent by everything that's happened within the indie space in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, the way that one person in the book put it that I thought was interesting is he said that he thought that the game master had all the fun, and so he wanted to break down the barriers between players and game masters and have more of a democratic process for deciding which direction the story goes, rather than just having the game master be sort of the dictator and who dictates everything.
Absolutely. That's a very important part of indie design. I've been writing some work on cooperative design lately with writing partner Christopher Allen, who I've also been working with. And two of the terms that we use a lot are authority and agency. Authority says, who is it that gets to make the final decisions? And agency says, who is it that gets to drive the direction of the story? And in traditional role-playing games, the authority was absolutely entirely invested in the game master, and the agency was primarily with the game master, though a good game master could push some or much of it over to the players. And one thing that a lot of indie designs have done, and particularly the GM-less games, which are mentioned here and there in Designers and Dragons, is that they have spread the authority out among all of the players, and they've also, in doing so, given everyone a lot more agency.
You said earlier that it takes a certain kind of person to want to design tabletop RPGs in the current market. You said like you have to be willing to sacrifice yourself or something like that. Could you say more about what kind of, since you know all these people, what kind of person is it that is willing to keep designing tabletop RPGs in the current market?
I think the average designer of a tabletop game in the current market is someone who cannot not design games. They are people who are driven by their ideas, by their creativity, and they just can't help themselves. They have all of these things bubbling up, and they want to make them available to other people. I think they love the systems they're creating. They love the stories that those systems can tell. They love the fans who are interested in their stories. I feel like the role-playing industry, especially as it is in the kind of wider industry, is very much a literal, figurative labor of love, that it's something that you just do it because you really want to, and because you have that creativity, that design sense, all of those things that make a good designer. The role-playing industry has always had very small margins. I think a lot of people don't understand how very, very little an average role-playing company makes, or an average designer makes, for a very lot of effort. But you just put those together and you get people in there who really want to be there because they have great things that they want to do.
I mean, if you were to compare them to fiction writers or to video game designers, do you think that there's something about the social nature of the games that they particularly value?
I think obviously they must value the social nature of the games because, fiction writers and video game designers, they don't get that same social element. Increasingly video game creators are making games that are used in social contexts, since they're massively multiplayer games, or at least semi-multiplayer games. But there's a divide there that you don't see in role-playing games. And so, I think that the average tabletop role-playing designer is certainly interested in the social interactions that he creates, though it varies from designers to designers. You go to more the story game side, and there are people that are very interested in enabling people to tell stories. You go more to the kind of vampire and other side of things like that, and those are people that are much more interested in the social interactions.
Right. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any other final thoughts or anything, or will there be future volumes of Designers and Dragons?
There will definitely be future volumes. I'm in a bit of a hiatus right now because I'm working on a big move, but starting next year I hope to get back to work. I have 4 to 5 volumes that are well in process, kind of giving a history of every D&D product ever produced by TSR or Wizards of the Coast. They were originally written for Drive-Thru RPG, and I'm compiling those into books. And I've also increasingly realized I'd really like to write a volume of lost histories talking about some of the companies I just didn't have space or time for in the original 4 volumes. And also, there's only 6 months left of the 10s, and so it's going to take a few more years to really see how they shake out, but I need to write a 10s volume at that point. As for final thoughts, I've always thought that the name that we've came up with for the books, Designers and Dragons, was very apt, because the role-playing industry is an industry that has been defined by those two things. The designers are people who really love what they're doing and have these great creative ideas and, are very, very important for anything that's produced in a way that I think is equaled only by a couple of other creative industries. And meanwhile, as we talked about earlier, we have all of these dragons, lawsuit, fraud, all of these other industries like comic books, collectible card games, video games, which have impacted the industry. And so a lot of the story has been about these designers fighting against these dragons to produce these games that we all love and change millions of lives.
That's funny that, I was thinking it was pretty hardcore to write 4 books about the history of tabletop role-playing, but you're actually working on 4 or 5 books just about TSR Wizards of the Coast, so it's even more hardcore than I ever imagined.
Yeah, well, I've always found that the easiest way to write a book is to write it one tiny bit at a time. And so Designers and Dragons looks impressive at 4 volumes, but it was only 100 articles that were written one at a time. And similarly, the TSR / Wizards of the Coast books seem pretty intimidating, even as I look at them now. But it's 1,000 articles written one at a time, and many of them were written for Drive-Thru RPG as they published the entire corpus of TSR and Wizards of the Coast publications over the course of 4 or 5 years. And so all I had to do was write 2 or 3 or 4 a week, and 5 to 6 years later, you have the basis of a book.
Yeah, well, it's a great series. I mean, and we haven't even mentioned the production values are great. The cover art, the layout. I mentioned how many illustrations there are inside. I mean, they're just beautiful books and just an unbelievable amount of detail. And so I would just strongly recommend, anyone who's interested in tabletop role-playing games, and especially if you're interested in writing or publishing tabletop role-playing games, you have to read these books, Designers and Dragons. And so we're going to wrap things up there. And so we've been speaking with Shannon Appelcline. So Shannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Shannon Appelcline for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Anastasia Frolova and Matt Ray, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.